The winter of 1943 settled over Bletchley like a pall of wet wool, muffling the world in a silence so thick it seemed to press against the ear. Frost-etched lacework on the inside of the hut's 6 windows, and beyond the glass, the skeletal trees stood sentinel in the grey dawn, their branches rattling faintly as though whispering secrets to the wind. Inside, the air hung dense with the scent of damp wool, cold tea, and the metallic temps of overheated vacuum tubes. My fingers, chapped and raw from the unrelenting chill, danced across the keys of the Typex machine with rehearsed precision, transcribing intercepts that arrived in relentless, cryptic streams from the WWII stations dotting the coast. Each cable carried fragments of the German war machine's inner workings convoy codes, U-boat coordinates, supply schedules encoded in the infernal mathematics of Enigma, which we unraveled stitch by painstaking stitch. I was Eleanor Winthrop, one of many young women conscripted into what the brass euphemistically called clerical duties. In truth, we were cryptanalysts in all but title, buried beneath layers of secrecy so deep that even our families believed we filed shipping manifests in London. 16-hour shifts blurred into one another beneath the green-shaded lamps, the only markers of time the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional clatter of boots in the corridor. We learned to read the language of rotors and reflectors, to spot the statistical ghosts in the noise patterns hidden in chaos, the tremor of a careless operator repeating a message key, the telltale stutter of a lazy cipher clerk. But what came through my headphones on the night of February 12th was unlike anything in the Admiral's briefing manuals or the dry technical memoranda from GC&CS. It began as a low-frequency, hummed the usual background static one, learned to ignore, like the constant thrum of your own pulse. But then, beneath it, a rhythm emerged. Not random, not atmospheric interference. A sequence, 3 sharp taps, a pause, 2 more, then silence. I adjusted the headset, convinced fatigue had conjured phantoms in the ether. Yet, when the transmission repeated an hour later, same frequency, same modulation, same pattern, I felt a cold coil tighten in my stomach. This was no U-boat acknowledging a sighting or a Wehrmacht field unit requesting resupply. The signal originated from a fixed position in northern Norway, near Hammerfest, a region known to house a small experimental Luftwaffe communications outpost, according to our intelligence. But the modulation, it bore the signature of a torn foo. D2 field radio, the kind issued to ground reconnaissance, not naval or air operations. And it was being fed into an Enigma machine, not as plain text, but as raw audio recorded, perhaps, and then keyed in by a compromised operator. I replayed the tape twice more, the hiss filling my skull like sand. On the third pass, I heard it, between the taps, a faint, irregular, tremor human breath, ragged and shallow. My hands began to shake. I glanced around, but the others were immersed in their own worlds of ciphers and cross-references. No one noticed. Protocol demanded I log anomalies and pass them up the chain. But something in me, if I reported this as a technical irregularity, it might vanish into the bureaucratic Icarus mist as ionospheric distortion or equipment malfunction. Yet the pattern, it was deliberate. Too precise. Too desperate. I remembered a fragment from a captured Abwehr manual. Morse code, disguised as static, could be transmitted via percussive interference on a microphone, diaphragma method once used by resistance cells in occupied France. But this was no Morse. The spacing was wrong. Then it struck me, it was binary. 3 taps for 111, 2 for 11. Crude, yes, but unmistakably a counting sequence. Someone was imprisoned near that transmitter, someone with access, however fleeting, to the microphone. Someone tapping not for rescue, but to be heard at all. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my narrow cot in the billet, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, replaying the recording in my mind. The Admiral's Standing Order 7B echoed in my memory. Operators are to report only analytically relevant deviations. Emotional inference is a liability. But what if the deviation was the message? What if the anomaly wasn't noise but voice? By morning, I had made my choice. I would not file a standard anomaly report. Instead, I transcribed the pattern into a series of dummy decrypts, bearing the sequence inside a fabricated Luftwaffe logistic cipher and routed it through a side channel to a friend in naval intelligence. A man who once told me over lukewarm cocoa in the canteen that the war isn't won by codes alone, but by listening to the silences between them. The next intercept came at 3:17. This time, the taps spelled out letters HELP. Then static. Then the unmistakable sound of metal striking metal, a boot on a floor, perhaps, or a fist against a wall. The transmission ended abruptly, as if torn Hawaii. I removed my headset slowly, my ears ringing not from the signal, but from the terrible weight of what I now knew. I was not deciphering a machine. I was eavesdropping on a soul, and they had no idea anyone was listening. Dawn broke over Bletchley, not with light, but with a slow seep of pewter-grey vapor that clung to the hedges and pooled in the low ditches bordering the estate. I arrived at Hut 6 before roll call, my boots crunching on the thin rime of ice that glazed the path, my mind still echoing with that final transmission. 3 letters, hammered out with what must have been unbearable effort, then swallowed by the static as though the walls themselves had closed in. I had slept, not a wink, only stared at the ceiling of my billet room, listening to the muffled sobs of another girl down the hole, homesick, heartbroken, or simply worn thin by the war's invisible toll. But my silence was different. It was the silence of complicity. By mid-morning, a coded memo arrived via pneumatic, tube, just 3 lines. Routed through Naval Section F under the guise of Luftwaffe signal drift analysis. My contact had seen it. He hadn't dismissed it. And now, the weight shifted. No longer was I merely witness, but conduit. I was instructed without explicit orders, for nothing at Bletchley was ever explicit to continue monitoring the frequency 7.342 MHz, assigned to Luftnachrichten Abteilung 53 ostensibly for weather reports out of Corkin, but everyone knew that unit had been reassigned to counterintelligence after the Abwehr purchase of 42. That this signal bled through their channel suggested either a compromised line or a prisoner being held at or near their facility. I sat at my station, headphones clamped tight, the hum of the Typex, a familiar drone beneath my ribs. Hour after hour, nothing but the usual Enigma rotors, clicking into place in my mind, the staccato bursts of routine traffic, convoy, JW53 outbound, Murmansk route confirmed, U for 37 requests fuel resupply at grid AE 92. Then, just after 19 o'clock, it returned. Not taps this time, but a rhythm of knocks. Slower, more labored. I transcribed it in shorthand on a scrap of paper hidden beneath my logbook, KK pause KK, then a scrape, like a body dragging across concrete, and then, faint but unmistakable, a whisper distorted, yes, but syllabic. Anna. My breath caught. Not a code name. A name. A real one. The kind you whisper when you think no one will ever hear you again. I spent the next 3 days in a fugue state, moving through routines like a ghost. I ate little, spoke less. My colleagues noticed nothing. We were all hollowed out in our own ways, but inside, a terrible calculus unfolded. If I pushed too hard, if I made this anomaly too visible, the Admiralty would shut the frequency down for security review, and with it, the only lifeline Visana had. Yet if I did nothing, if I waited for official channels to act, she might vanish entirely. The Gestapo had begun liquidating non-essential prisoners in Norway after the failed sabotage at the Vemork heavy water plant. Time was not a luxury, it was a noose. On the 4th night, the signal changed again. This time, it wasn't binary, or Morse. It was a sequence of Enigma key settings, deliberately incorrect, repeated with slight variations. At first I thought it noise, but then I saw the pattern. The rotor positions mirrored those used by a specific MO operator WWII nicknamed Krautfritz for his sloppy message keys. He'd been active near Tromsk until December. Had Anna overheard his routines? Was she mimicking them to prove she was human, not a glitch? I made a decision I knew could end my career or worse. Using a spare Y service recorder, I spliced the anomalous segments into a forged Luftwaffe weather cipher, then slipped the reel into the outgoing batch, destined for RAF Medmanome's photo-in, who often cross-referenced signals with aerial reconnaissance. If anyone could match an audio anomaly to a physical location, it was them. I included no note, no explanation, only the tape, only the hope that someone would listen. 2 days later, an unmarked envelope appeared in my pigeonhole. Inside, a single sheet, a grainy aerial photograph of a remote compound near Hummer, a radio mast, a small outbuilding with a barred window, scrawled in pencil at the bottom, grid 6938 N2341A. Thermal scan shows one occupant, alive. For now, I stood in the corridor, trembling, the paper damp in my hands. They knew. Someone knew. That evening, I tuned in one last time. The frequency was quiet for nearly an hour. Then, just as I was about to log off, a new pattern emerged. Not taps, not knocks, but a single sustained tone, rising and falling like a breath, and beneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, a hum, not static. A lullaby, a German Folktune, Guten Abend, Gute Nacht. She was singing to herself, or perhaps to me. I never heard from her again. The frequency went dead on March 4th. No explanation. No follow-up. Weeks later, a routine decrypt mentioned the decommissioning of auxiliary comes post-Homerfesti due to sabotage risk. The file was closed. The war rolled on. But I kept the recording, buried in a biscuit tin beneath my floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth, and sometimes, on nights when the silence of peacetime feels too heavy, I play it not to solve a cipher, but to remember that behind every broken signal, every intercepted line of code, there was a voice, and someone once chose to listen.